So, welcome everybody. My name is Daniel Foor, and it's good to be here. I actually lived in the Bay Area for 11 years up until a couple years ago, and my wife and new daughter and I live in Asheville, North Carolina now. I'm from Ohio originally, and my lineages of blood are early English, German, and Irish settlers, colonizers to Pennsylvania and Ohio. From Ohio. And I feel like I want to say just a little about my own background, because I am meeting most of you for the first time. And if I'm listening to somebody, I like to have a little context on who I'm listening to. So I wasn't raised with anything about ritual or spirituality, really. It's just marginally Methodist and wasn't that into it. And I sought it out even as a teenager, and so I got involved in contemporary shamanism and pagan things, and went and did a degree in religious studies, then a master's and a PhD in psychology. I did a doctorate at Saybrook here, based in the city, and I did my master's at the Institute of Transpersonal Psychology, now Sophia. So I'm a licensed therapist, and I have that background in psychology, and wrote a dissertation on the use of shamanic healing methods in clinical mental health settings. So I have that side of things. But mostly my focus has been with ritual and ceremony and spirituality. And I'm an initiate in West African Ifa, Orisha tradition, in Yoruba speaking West Africa, Southwest Nigeria. So I go back and forth to Nigeria for training and study. But my training with religion and spirituality has been a bit eclectic. So I've spent time in Native North American ceremonial ways, like Lakota ways in Native American church. And I don't presume to represent these ways, but they've been an influence, and spent time with Mongolian shaman teacher a bit, and with Islam in North Africa, so Foor scholar in Egypt. And so I've traveled a bit and had the good fortune to study with different teachers. And that eclectic background has meant for me what I would describe as a non-dogmatic approach to ritual and ceremony that is focusing on the fundamentals and helping people in the West, most of whom don't have a strong tradition they're coming out of, to sink into something of substance without having necessarily to declare an identity with one established path, although that's also a way we can go with it. And my approach to spiritual things has evolved over time, of course, and is what I would describe as animist, which is a little bit of a clunky academic word. It's being reclaimed, and usefully, I think, to describe a way of relating with the world that says living human beings are just one kind of person, one kind of relative, something like that, in a much wider field of relationships that includes the animals, plants, stones, rivers, mountains, deities, the ancestors. Some of these other people have visible to us bodies, some of them don't. And a well-cultivated person learns how to relate well and is ethically accountable to these other kinds of people. That includes other living humans, who we tend often to objectify and not treat very fairly. And it also includes the other than humans, the beings whose bodies we think of as nature in English. And I call that animism because I think it's better to call it that than indigenous spirituality, although it's kind of also that. The word indigenous at this point, I think, is best used to describe indigenous peoples and indigenous concerns, and kind of, if you're not an indigenous person like myself, as I'm not, then it's awkward and counterproductive to try to claim that, and respect to indigenous sovereignty and spiritualities and all that. So many indigenous people probably, if they took the animist questionnaire, would be like, yeah, okay, I guess we're that, but we don't need that word to describe ourselves. And I think it's a little better language than shamanism. That's my own bias, partly because shamanism, unfortunately, has become a little bit of an older white people subculture in the West. That sounds so judgy. I don't mean to lead with judgment. But it's a word that has a negative connotation for a lot of Native North American people, and somewhat fairly, somewhat unfairly. And I know a lot of good people who come out of a background of shamanism and whatnot, but it's a word that's taken on some baggage. And so if you're going to reclaim it, you need to really have a strong anti-racist, decolonizing ethic, and know where you're coming from about those issues. So the word animism feels a little more descriptive of just a way of seeing the world. It doesn't mean you're going to vocationally be a shaman, right? And not all animist people work ritually in the way that Mongolian, Siberian shamans tend to work ritually. Like in Yoruba tradition, we don't do a ton of out-of-body experience. Like in heavy, full-on ritual, if there's going to be strong spirit contact, it's usually from an incorporated stance of the spirits moving through your body. And sometimes in shamanic practice, the out-of-body thing is emphasized. And so there are nuances once you get up in it. So anyways, I'm an animist. And within that, I've developed over the years a specialization in work with the human dead, with the ancestors. And so let me operationalize that term a little, which is, sorry, and I haven't slept much. We have a new baby at home. She's great. Talking about the ancestors coming back. And the ancestors, in the broadest sense, people talk about them as all like the bears and the wind and the trees, and this very kind of poetic, expanded way. And that's beautiful and fine, and it's not quite how I mean it personally. What I mean is the human dead, all the ones who are previously alive in human form, but whose form is not physically incarnate right now so much, unless they're working through you in that moment. And so you think of human as having one foot in the visible, one in the invisible. And so they're the part of our human community that's not physically incarnate right now, but they dwell in the present. They're here right now. And a more narrow definition of ancestors would be those among the dead who are relatively well in spirit, in contrast to the ghosts, the troubled dead, the not yet ancestors. The ones who have died, they're no longer physically incarnate, but they have not yet been seated or well established among the dead. So they're kind of in a transitional state still, even if that lasts for a long time. So we'll unpackage that more in a sec, but in any case, the ancestors can include those who are related to you by geography, like ancestors of the land. Like we're on traditional Ohlone land here, but I'm pretty sure most people in the room are not full-blood Ohlone people. And so we are in a place where the spiritual ecology and the history and the land itself is connected to these ancestors of place who are not related to by blood. So they have ritual importance and cultural importance here. And they're ancestors of spiritual lineage. If you step into a tradition that's not of your blood people, you're connected to those ancestors. And ancestors in vocation, like if you're training as a psychologist, for example, there are people who have created that field ahead of you. And so we can relate with ancestors for all different kinds of reasons. And within that, I've specialized and worked with ancestors of blood because I think they have a lot of influence, ritually, spiritually, psychologically. So within that specialization, you could think of all the rituals that engage the ancestors of blood around the world. And most of them on Earth could fall into the category of rituals of maintenance, meaning that assumes the ancestors are basically well, and that the human society or culture or individual is basically well, and it's about just tending to that relationship over time. So making space for the ancestors to speak, inviting them in at funerals and births and weddings, and making a space for just renewal of relationship. So you're tending to a basically intact relationship. Now, there's another smaller category of rituals that usually are handled by religious specialists in different cultures that are, you could think of as rituals of repair. Like something's gone wrong with the maintenance rituals were not enough. Something's gone off track, and there's a need to get in there and address what's happened. Often it's that someone who has died has not yet transitioned to become an ancestor. So that rite of passage that begins with the death of the body and completes with the one who's died being seated as a well ancestor. Something went wrong with the usual funerary rites and grieving process, so a year has passed or whatever amount of time has passed, and they haven't left yet. So you have a ghost problem. It's the most common type of ritual of repair or intervention that would be needed. And if there are collective traumas that happen to a community, that could require a kind of ritual intervention of some sort. So we have 500 years, it's been a good 500 years since Europe barfed out a history of colonialism and oppressive, racist, genocidal behavior on the non-European world. I'm generalizing here. I know the history is nuanced, but hang with me. And another 1,000+ years in Europe before that happened, that kind of contagion or cultural virus, if you will, was. Are you really going to describe Christianity as a cultural virus, Daniel? I am. I think. I don't. It sounds judgy. I don't mean all Christians. But what I mean to say is that, insofar as Christianity in some ways got hijacked by its own infection of Roman Empire, the combination of empire and Christianity meant a disconnection from ancestral, earth-honoring, locally rooted wisdoms for a lot of European peoples. And that disconnection from indigenous or animist sensibilities within Europe contributed to a real off-track kind of thing that took the form of genocidal behavior toward Native people, African peoples, etc. And so the context for that is that we can't just jump to rituals of maintenance with our ancestors. I'm generalizing here. If you were, how many people, show of hands, were raised in a home that had a healthy framework for you to relate directly and supportively with your blood ancestors in spirit? Like that was a normal thing. That was normalized. It was welcome. Right. So half, like, so it's like, 5% of the room maybe. And because of that, if you have a friend and you don't call them for 30 years, and then you just call them and say, hey, how was your day? You're like, really? Really? Like, back up. Like, we got some catching up to do, right? And so what happens, I've seen it really lovely indigenous teachers in the West jump into teaching kind of modern Western people about ancestor stuff from a framework of rituals of maintenance. They're jumping right into like, yeah, let's just maintain this relationship. I'm like, oh, you got to back up. There's damage. There's centuries of compounded damage and ghost trouble and all kinds of funk involved. I see it in contemporary pagan circles. They're like, ancestors are good. We should invoke them. And then people invoke the ancestors. And if it's done without nuance and the invocation works, there is a possibility that who responds to the invocation is a mixture of those among the dead who are quite well in spirit and those who are not yet well in spirit. And those who are not yet well in spirit, the ghosts, the troubled dead, are not necessarily a beneficial influence. It's like just invoking humans. If you're going to have a sweet party or wedding, you don't want to invite anyone randomly. You want to invite people you know and trust, right? And so it's like that with the dead. You want to bring discernment to the work with the dead. And so, having said that, what I have tended to specialize in over the last 12, 15 years of doing this work is ritual repair work with ancestors of blood. And there's job security in it. Oh my God. I didn't really set out to specialize in that, but I have turned a corner in the last year of I don't see new clients anymore. I only train other people in how to guide this work for others. And then so people are interested in doing the work. To do the work, I'm like, go work with the people I've trained. And the trainings I'm doing, they're full, and I'm having to learn how to say no to good people. So it's not because I'm so cool, but I think it's because there's a need for this kind of work. And I've tried to make it non-dogmatic and accessible and psychologically grounded and ritually still juicy and effective. So the way in which, one important assumption, if it's not clear, is that not all among the dead, not all those who die are well, but they can change. The dead who are not yet well can become well. One of the ways that the psychological, cultural damage of colonialism and the gnarly history shows up in our ritual practice here in the West, and in social justice circles when people don't haven't really unpackaged the spiritual implications of what they're saying, is that people tend to freeze their ancestors in state, meaning that if you're people were acted in harmful ways, then it's seen as somehow the beneficial thing to do to just condemn them permanently. And that's not actually very ritually transformative or useful. Any more than saying, like, when you were in your 20s, you were really arrogant. Therefore, now that you're 45 and have gone through all kinds of therapy and transformative process, I can't even talk to you because 20 years ago you were annoying. It's like, well, is that really the grown-up position that we want to dig in with? And so the dead don't stop existing just because the ancestors continue to, like, we continue to exist after death. And so if people acted harmfully during life, there's a need actually for even greater care and ritual intervention to help them to become well in spirit. Because to do otherwise is to invite the creation of ghost that's harmful for the community. In some traditional societies, when a person is executed, the people who are carrying out their execution are also entrusted with making sure that they transition as an ancestor. Because it's recognized that people need, it's a communal decision that someone is not, it's going to be best for them to proceed to the next stage of their journey. But they're not actually exiled from the community. So the execution is an act of love, really. It's they just expedited growth. And we don't hold it in that way. I'm not making a case for capital punishment, but I'm saying that we don't abandon the dead. And the idea that judging our ancestors is a kind of transformative final stance, it's not actually that interesting as a position. And to the contrary, once we've done the work to make sure that our specific people of blood, whoever they are well in spirit, they can be excellent allies in whatever type of decolonizing, like radical cultural change, like anti-racist work, whatever it is, whatever work you're doing. Sometimes the people who acted very harmfully during their time on Earth, once they've been ritually seated as ancestors, they're actually quite motivated to assist in the repairs that are needed, right? So that I have the book that I wrote and the work that I've been teaching up until the last 2 or 3 years, it didn't necessarily make really foreground the implications for cultural healing. It's like I needed to just look down and do like a decade of full-time cleanup work with blood lineage ancestors to start to really see the patterns and implications for cultural healing. And having done that, let me articulate what I see as a few of those patterns, and then let's be in dialogue, because it's going to be more lively that way. I'm working with a simplified map of a half-dozen cultural toxins or woundings that are that capture not everything, but a lot of the cultural state that we're in right now and trying to untangle. And all of these can usefully be understood as ancestral inheritances and worked with ritually on that level. In no particular order, because they're all like deeply connected and, you know, acute intersectionality discussion, like they're connected. Can't separate them out. First is the disconnection from the other than human world. And so take all the language that many of you have developed about problematic ways that, whether it's trans people, people of color, people with less money, people are not Americans, get objectified, treated badly, there's a kind of erasure of their voices and their authentic expression. So take all that really awesome sensibility around how to do better with relationships and accountability and transfer that to how humans relate to the other than humans. Because not always, but sometimes, people who are doing fantastic work as cultural change agents and activists are unknowingly participating in the erasure of the voices of the other than humans. And sometimes the earthy, witchy people who are really focused on the earth healing work have big, gnarly blind spots around race and class, etc. So a lot of people have a piece of the overall picture. But all of our lineages, at some point, some more recently, but some people still, and some more distantly, like myself. At some point, though, our people had basically this kind of framework where living units are in this much larger field of relationships with other people. And they're not all human people. They're tree people, stone people, deer people, etc. And so when we lose that framework, we suffer, and the rest of the earth suffers. And you get ecological catastrophe, like what we're living through right now, and will be for at least the next century if things go well. So there's that. Two, there's massive inequality around sharing of resources, greed, class troubles, unequal distribution of wealth, and the illusion that you can have more than your neighbor, and that's okay, like to a large degree. Typically what happens in a healthy system is if you end up having more for whatever reason, then you have more responsibility and more people to take care of, and so more status as a result. That's how it is in Nigeria. When I was there in June, my teacher and I, we just drove around the community in Oderemo one day appreciating people. And so you go to their house, you give them money, they pray for you. Go to the house, give them money, they pray for you. And it's ritual protection as well. So if you're going to have prosperity, then it comes with status. And if you have status, then you need to take care of people. And so, of course, we have that really not in balance in all kinds of ways. But the wounding that comes down to us along our lineages has very real physiological body level effects. We have food scarcity, or people have been oppressed at times generationally, violently, for their labor, for their work. And so these are body level wounds that are transmitted. Another toxin number 3 out of 6 is all the trouble around sex, sexuality, gender, which is a big umbrella thing, which is to say patriarchy, misogyny, violence toward women, judgment and persecution of people for same-sex relationships, for diverse gender identities, for expressions of sexual expression that doesn't conform to rigid cultural standards. So that whole big umbrella of troubles, I don't need to unpackage that more. So I'm trying to, at a very high level, observe like some different cultural fault lines that come through our bloodlines. A fourth would be what I would think of as religious extremism or dogmatism, or the illusion of owning the truth, and the way that people are persecuted based on belief. And another would be the wounding of colonialism and the physical occupation by force of other people's space without consideration for the value of their relationships with the land and their way of seeing the world. And then another would be all the ways that racism plays out, and which is in some ways historically perhaps the most recent type of trouble. I mean, when we say racism, at least in this cultural moment, we tend to mean the history of white supremacy and the way that the illusion of different races was created by Europeans to justify economic exploitation of African and Native and other peoples, ongoing. It's not, I don't mean to speak of it in past tense. It's not past tense. But that particular construct of different races, it existed a bit before European colonialism. I mean, it was present in Greek culture and Arab culture and Arab slavery toward African people. But mostly it doesn't get a lot of traction until the 1700s. And but it's super toxic and deadly and fatal, genocidal. So, and most of the ancestors of people in the room are bound up in it somehow or another. And so it's part of, we're down lineage from these troubles. And what happens a lot of times is either people just kind of compartmentalize it and avoid all of it. And so like, well, I'm just an individual, I don't know about all that. Which is suddenly, if you do that, you're isolated, you're disconnected from vitality, and that's problematic. or you just kind of crack open to all of it. But what's often most recently reaching us is the recent dead and the influence from the recent dead, and often they're not that well because somebody's ritually been taking care of them. And so what you get is like this heaviness that's bigger than you. So you have intergenerational, like ghost, grief, funk, heaviness that you're then walking around within your body and trying to work out 1 hour a week in therapy, and it's hard to get traction on it, right? And the basic way that I approach this is, one, to have boundaries with the dead who are not yet well. Just like you would have boundaries with the living who are not yet well. It's okay to have sovereignty and personal space and boundaries in the realms of the spirits as well. It's critically important if you're going to intentionally engage. And because they'll engage with you whether or not you're engaging with them. So a lot of people, as I see it, are living under, they're in a little, like pig pen cloud of ghost interference. And just because we don't have a framework for it doesn't mean they don't exist. Like germs existed before microscopes. And so it's like that with ghosts. Just because we lose a framework for it, they don't stop drawing on our energy. So you have boundary with that. And then call directly on the ancestors who are well, the ones who lived before these disruptions that I'm speaking of, and who are now in the present quite well and available in spirit. And all of us, even the most like waspy, disconnected, my ancestors were slave owners, white people, if you go back far enough in your lineages, there are people who lived before that kind of problematic behavior who were earth-connected, kind, wise, witchy, and interesting, and available for relationship in the present. And so the approach, in short, is to connect with the very well energies, older in our lineages, come into relationship with those ancestral guides and teachers and ask them to safely and gradually transform the heaviness and difficulty in our lineages. Said another way, we ask the well ancestors to ancestralize or assist the dead who are not yet well to become well, to transition from a ghost condition to a well-seated ancestor. And gradually, in doing that, your own lineages become a source of nourishment and healing and vitality, so that you can remember personally even more clearly what you're here to do. Do that in partnership with them, with their backing and protection, and help out culturally, because we're in crisis. But if you just freak out and be like, I'm just going to walk into the swamp of grief and feel things strongly, that is compelling in one sense, but it's not entirely skillful in terms of sustainability as a strategy, right? I said I was going to not talk the whole time. I'm almost done, and then we'll be in dialogue. I'll say that, let me give a little context on what I'm doing. I've led these 3-day ancestor trainings since 2005, started in San Mateo. We're doing one this weekend, but unfortunately the spaces are full. But from doing that training, which steps people through this process of connecting, establishing boundaries with the unwell energies in your lines, not disowning them, just asking them to be anywhere but in your body. It's like, just back up, that's all. Like, I got it, just be anywhere but right here. And then 2, connect with the older ones in the line who are well. And then 3, start to heal up the older part of the lineage that came after those well ones, that's between these well ones in the recent times. So you're repairing the lineage from the older times toward the present. And then the 4th of the 5 steps that we work through in that training is to work with the recent dead. Like if your father's passed and he was an abusive alcoholic, let's say, and you know he's not well in spirit, you don't even have to tune in about it, you just know. And you don't work with him in spirit until his father and all the men before him, back to ancient, goddessy, dirt worshiping times, are deeply well. And so your grandfather, all the way back, as a group, they're able to then step forward and receive your father and bring him the healing that he needs. There's a respect for the seniority of the lineage by having the older ones receive the younger ones. And so the 4th of the 5 steps is to make sure the recent dead in your lineage of focus are well. And then the final step is to embody the blessings of that line personally for the well-being of your living family, yourself, the world, so that you're a clear channel, if you will, or a vessel for your ancestors' blessings to move through you in the world. Now, if our culture wasn't jacked up, you wouldn't need to do that repair work. But when I asked how many people were raised with a real framework for this, nobody really raised their hand. And so we're down lineage from a cultural disaster that's been playing out for, 500 to 2,000 years, typically. So from doing that a lot over a decade with folks, it has now become training other people in how to guide that work for others. And the focus of the second book, which I've begun to work on, is how to take that as a foundational kind of practice to then partner with our ancestors for cultural healing, for directly addressing the kinds of trouble that I was speaking to. Because once you've healed up the way that legacies of racism, sexism, colonialism, etc., live in your own ancestry and blood, and it actually is possible to heal that up to a large degree. And I'm not saying that that means the systems around you have become radically positive, but it is possible to have your ancestors be deeply well in spirit, even if they lived in very adverse circumstances during life, because the dead continue to change. They are alive, they're not dead, so to speak, in English, and they're not defined by their experience a year or 10 years or 200 years ago only, nor do they wish to be frozen in our perception in that experience. So when you're in relationship with them, you allow them to be in their new healed condition, you work with them, then you can partner with them to start to bring that healing to the world, to others. So that's keeping me busy these days. So let me say just that much, and that's being dialogue. And if you don't mind sharing your name when you ask a question, that's nice, because we're lightly in ritual space, and it is being recorded. So thanks.
Yep.
Hi, my name is Monica. I'm really curious actually to hear about the ancestral trauma, patriarchy, misogyny, the pain that's collected around the systems of gender and sexuality, and what have you heard from the well ancestors about what existed and what can exist in possibility? What was there and what became possible?
This is a huge question. I don't, in my mind, tend to separate what do I say? I don't feel like it's possible to separate out the woundings of sort of patriarchy, misogyny, from really restrictive gender norms, and the quite binary way that gender has been constructed in the West and other places, but I'll speak from what I know. And I don't feel like it's possible to separate that out from restrictive views of sexual expression. So you can't have real healed energy around patriarchy, misogyny, and still be homophobic, or still be really sex negative or shaming. So for the first thought is these things are all connected, right, as I see it. Another way to think about it is when our ethics around consent with the other than humans break down, meaning we're not asking permission, we're just taking of the earth, because we've ceased to have a relational, respectful, consent-based way of being with the other than humans, whose bodies we eat to survive, or whose bodies we cut to make structures, things like that. I think the same lack of consent can start to root in with human-to-human relationships. I don't know that it's such a linear thing, but when you have lack of a deeply reverent culture that's based in consent and embodied pleasure and knowing and a body-rooted wisdom, then that affects everything else, right? I don't know them personally, but I think there's a beneficial teaching in the Sex at Dawn work from Christopher Ryan and the other co-author, whose name is escaping me right now. But their point in that work, as I understand it, is that our perception of the earlier histories, prehistory, if you will, of sexual expression and relationships tends to involve a lot of projecting of Christian-informed monogamy by white, male, European. Yeah, so whatever. And if you're Christian, like, sorry, I don't mean to give you so much heat, but I do a little bit, because there's a lot of harm that's been done in the name of your tradition. And so if you want to be a Christian, you kind of need to hang with that and find ways to repair it. And so so it's important to not project our own sort of restrictive cultural norms in the West onto all of history. And in that sense, what I'm saying is that if you are genderqueer, same-sex relationships, really focused on like the erotic and its connection to other aspects of life, or whatever it is, if your sense of the sacred and what matters to you is really rooted in embodied knowing, embodied pleasure, and healthy relationships, and all that, I think it's fair to say that you can look to older ancestors that are pre-colonialism and dial it back, and you will find ancestors, men, women, and people who don't conform to that binary English way of framing it, who can be allies in the present and help you to see that your own affinity for those things is actually a restoration of blessings, and it's not a new thing. It might feel like a culturally new moment, but it's actually a restoration of diversely gendered, beautiful expression that has been interrupted, sometimes for quite a while, along the bloodlines. And so even just that, to watch people in ritual realize that families who have caused them to feel at times suicidally exiled, and to have them realize, oh, along those same bloodlines, my sexual orientation is an ancestral gift. What? Like, the thing that has caused me to feel most separate from my family is an inheritance from family, and I've been entrusted with the ancestors to restore these particular blessings to the lineage. But that's a paradigm shift, right? Sometimes for people. I'm kind of skirting around it, but your question is there, do you want to say, give me more of an anchor? Because I'm just rambling a little bit, but those are a few observations.
Thank you. Yeah, I guess, well, and it's interesting because I think my ancestry is South Asian. So, a lot of the cultural context is not very similar, but at the same time, this is my dissertation, in some ways, like healing of the motherline, calling in the ancestor circles and seeing what they have to speak about, particularly about what is possible in South Asia. So which is why I was so interested even in hearing from you, because you work with the Yoruba tradition and many other traditions where I know that there are particular ways in which there are divinities, there are female bodies and male bodies, and at the same time there are also medicine people. There are ways in which medicine people are allowed access or not allowed access to perform these rituals or to sit with communities, and that's part of my question, I guess.
Let me say two other things. One is, because colonialism requires amnesia about history in order to operate, it means that when we start to come out of that amnesia, sometimes we reach for something more authentic, and we only get the most recent strata of history right before the colonialism. Like, to look at my own European ancestors, if I reach to Viking tradition, like, there are things about Vikings that are great, and other things that are really super problematic and violent. And what's important to know is that in the cultures in that part of the world, that particular era from 200 to let's say 800 current era is just one layer of the culture. There's an earlier culture, layer of culture before that, before that, before that. It's the same where I live in North Carolina. I'm not of Native North American ancestry, but it's traditional Cherokee, it's Slavey territory. But the Cherokee people weren't there for so long. They might have just, a lot of them were just there for a couple hundred years, if that, before Europeans arrived. Before that, it was Mississippian cultures, which are heavily shaped by the domestication of corn and had a lot more hierarchy and things that we would see as complicated on a class level. And so before that, the woodland period is, it's 1,500 years back. So if I want to look to, and when you just tune in and look at the archaeological record, I'm like, oh, these cultures feel different intuitively. They have a different center of gravity and a way of relating. And so when you're looking to pre-colonialism cultures for inspiration, bring nuance to it. That's what I'm saying. And don't just allow the most recent strata before the disruption to define everything that came before it. But the most important piece when we're talking about the ancestors is to not just talk about them. And so you alluded to that, is to actually make space to relate with them. A lot of the people, even around ritual, that include in any way the ancestors, mostly just talk about them rather than listen to them. And you can invoke them or something, but then do you pause and be like, oh, what are they saying? Oh, interesting. They're saying something totally different than what I thought. So to be in relationship with them is the most important. And I'm sure you have, but to bring these questions to them directly and knowing what questions to ask can be helpful, but mostly you make a space to actually listen to your own ancestors. If we did that, it would be harder to manipulate, and things would get all kinds of interesting culturally. So, thanks. That's good. Yeah. Others? What? Anything's welcome. You can share your name if you would.
Sure. I'm Molly.
Great.
And I'm sixth generation descendant in California from the Spanish conquistadors.
Mm-hmm.
And the other side of my family came from Ireland in the 1820s, escaping the penal laws in Ireland. That's maybe a simple question that would be answered in your book. But as far as unwellness, is there then a difference in this unwellness as from being a perpetrator or an oppressor versus the unwellness of being oppressed?
Yeah. It's a very simple question. No, kidding. A couple things. The way I'm a little Germanic and systematic, engineer-minded in some ways. So the way that I lay it out in the book and encourage people to think of it is on a 1 to 10 scale, from dangerously ghosty to bodhisattva. I just cry when I think about it. It's so good. That's like the 10 end of the spectrum. So the higher the better. So the 1 to 3 range are the really funky, like, this is not well, ghosty energy, like bad dream, like the people you meet who are incarnate in that 1 to 3 range, you're like, I'm just going to back up and peace, need to get out of the car, move along. So it's the sense of danger, unwellness, or fragmentation. Like the 1 to 3 folks can't accurately self-report on their own condition. So that's an element of toxicity or energetic leaking, if you will. 4 to 6 range for the ghosts are the regular ghosts. Like they're like, I died. What's up? So they're like, I'm not sure what to do now. And so you tune in with grandma and she's like, yeah, dead. And they haven't necessarily left, or they're not like haunting you, they're just like ruminating on their life on Earth, or they're just like staring at the wall in Ghostland or whatever. They're just hanging out. And the 7 to 10 range are what I consider actual ancestors. Those who are connected in with other well-dead, they know they're dead. They're like, oh yeah, this whole other, next phase of life. What do you need? We're here, working. They're networked in. There's a group intelligence about them. So if any one of your dead are not in that 7 to 10 range, in my way of holding it, They're ghosts still. It's not meant as a judgment, but I set a high bar around it. And I say, even for the people who I train in the work as I guide it does not call for interacting with the ghosts at all. And that's not how the method goes. And
So you don't have a scale of unwellness?
no, that's
Ghosts themselves, of what they've done and how...
no, it doesn't. This is the second part. This is the controversial part. People could be fucking horrible in life and just relate badly with other people. If you have bad ethics, chances are.
They did genocide.
Now I know, but that's your opinion of them. That's what I'm saying. People can have related really well with others. Good chance that because they're being ethical and enacting good things, they're reinforcing an ethic of interconnectedness or generating kind of merit or positive karma, so they're probably going to have a better experience after death, but not necessarily. Some people could behave well, and you personally could think well of them, and they could do good work, and after death they could be just in a nightmare they can't wake up from. They're a ghost. They're stuck. It's not like the good people get the good things and the bad people get the bad things. It's not a fair structure. And it's not set up quite like that. That's our opinion of them. And your people could have acted harmfully during life, and they work it out in spirit. There's no like fair daddy god to punish them accordingly. It's not set up that way. And so people, it's not that folks don't on some soul level have accountability with their actions, but they could act really harmfully, die, and then be like, oh, Jesus, that was terrible. Like, sign me up for the purifying fire. Where's it at? And then they go through this like process of atoning. And they're like, whoa, okay, show me how to help. Let me do better. And then they do better. And then in a couple of years, they're like shiny ancestors or less. And then 200 years later, when their descendants comes along and they're like, you owned slaves or you were a conquistador. And that's all about you. That's not actually reflective of their condition and spirit in the present. The dead change. And I was sitting in a talk with Joseph Rouse years ago in Mountain View, a Pueblo Ute elder, like full-blood native dude, really mystical, interesting person. And there was someone in the audience who was saying, but my people are from conquistador ancestry, and I'm not saying you're saying this, but a little bit you are. And they were saying, but my people are losers, and he's like, you need to forgive them. And they're like, but they did all these bad things, how can I? And he's like, you need to forgive them. And they're like, but, and on a process level, they were telling the native person, like, no, you're wrong, I need to judge them. He's like, no, you need to forgive them. So it's a funny, like, interaction in that sense. And, but what I understood him to be saying is like, look, they exist in the present, just holding them in judgment is not actually a transformative stance. Now, your forgiving of them is a relevant, different process, and just because they could have changed doesn't mean they have. They could actually be quite troubled in spirit still. Now, that's what I'm saying is you come with a fresh perspective and know that our opinion of the dead may or may not correspond to where they're actually at. And there's a need to allow for them to change. We want that ourselves during life.
So they have their own agency?
Yeah, exactly. Yes.
But so what are we repairing them? Why are we involved in their...
Why are we needed in the
Yeah,
process?
right.
It's a good question. I see it different ways. One, we're not totally. They're doing their own thing. So that's part of the thing. Another is that there's something about the involvement of the living that completes a circuit ritually with the other world or the other dimension. And our involvement is relevant in that way. Like there's a link that's they get the ghosts get stuck. They get lost. The reality is so like what's the word for it? Like dimensionally elaborate or something. So there are many places to get lost for a long time. And if the older ancestors, the well ones, who have the capacity to intervene, haven't been called upon, there's a kind of politeness or consent, if you will, that they're like, oh, you want us to help? All you have to do is ask. We didn't ask. So we're going to do it. We're not just going to impose if you're not asking. So they need to be asked, for one. And
we get asked for our the old ancestors, for the more current ancestors.
yeah, absolutely. No, that's exactly what, that's my day job.
Okay.
And that's becoming other people's day job. That's the exact, like the living human people that I step through this work do not do the work. Exactly. Our job is to show up and be like, hey, older ancestors, grandmas, grandpas, we got a problem down here in the present. Like a kind of bad problem. And the response is usually like either, oh yeah, no, we were noticing that. We were wondering when you might call. Or like, indeed you do. Huh, thanks for asking. Whatever it is, they're like, bring us a candle, a steak, a bottle of whiskey, some incense, whatever. Like bring us, like feed us, and we'll handle it. And you need to sit there and grieve and beg the earth for forgiveness while we do it, but we're going to handle it. So it's not that the living, that we don't have a role, because we do. One of the roles we have is to like feel the feelings and actually reset all the ways that colonialism and cultural doom lives in our body. And so that we can transform that shit, so we're not just recycling it. Yeah. But you can't replace a mess with nothing. There needs to be some bigger, more interesting, beneficial force to take the place of it. And so, though the ancestors can bring that, we incarnate their gifts, often unconsciously. Whatever good qualities are allowing you to live this long and hopefully have a good life, most of those, as I would see it, are ancestral blessings or inheritances, whether or not they're consciously framed as such. And almost like at this point, and this is, said as a therapist, I did my 3,000 hours, like I'm a therapist. Most psychological trouble, for one, most of it's ancestral in the sense that it's intergenerational. And that's good news, actually. And another way of saying it is all wounding is cultural wounding. Like or almost all of it. Even the stuff that happens like in the intimate, painful space of like family kind of wounding, it's the small scale manifestation of bigger patterns of disconnect and cultural trouble. That matters because it can help to remove a layer of shame and isolation in the way we frame our suffering. And it matters because if you're going to see that, like, how many people are training in therapy or have some kind of psychology thing going on? Like, okay, just maybe half the room only. Good for you for the other half. Way to not all be therapists. And what's that?
Somebody has to be a client.
Yeah, exactly, right. No, therapists make good clients, actually. And so if you frame everything as personal, then you're going to just try to work it out on a personal level. And you'll get, it may or may not work. But it basically is this like, all the little trouble in this circle is my trouble, and I'm going to really diligently try to fix it. Okay, that's one approach. Gives you a sense of control, maybe, even if it's not very effective. And if you make the leap to say, oh, well, these troubles are actually inherited intergenerational cultural troubles. Great, I feel less ashamed about that and more connected through suffering to others. Let's still try to work out these collective level poisons with personal level tools. Yeah, that's not going to work. It's a mismatch in scale. And so if you want to see your struggle or the struggle of the people you support as inherited intergenerational stuff, then you need to find ways to bring inherited intergenerational medicines to those troubles in order to be effective at it. Or else you're throwing your client under the bus, or you're trying to, through your own personal individual will, stop a tidal wave. And it's going to suck for you, and it's not going to be that effective. And so there are, working with the well ancestors is not the only way, but it's one way to bring a bigger spiritual, or spiritual is kind of a dumb word, something bigger in the relational field than just your individuality to the situation for remedy. In other words, people say, okay, you're not going to get more than you can handle. It's totally dumb New Age way of talking, but sometimes I would add to it, though. Sorry for being so snarky. Is sometimes we get more than we can handle, so that we are pushed by the spirits to learn about our profound dependence on others, and so that we learn how to ask for help and get out of this cultural damage that it says, I need to take care of everything. And if our ancestors who are well in spirit are one of those sources we can turn to, well, that's good. That's good on a couple levels, because especially most of the white people I meet, maybe not most, yeah, I'd probably say most. Most of the introspecting white people I meet have some real self-hatred they're carrying around, almost like a badge of commitment to the cause. And it's just not sexy, it's not useful for the cause, and if it gets you to the point of facing what's ugly about the history of European colonialism, that's worthwhile. But self-hatred actually isn't that useful in the cause, so to speak. So keep with it, yeah. And so having your own ancestors be beneficial teachers and guides can be one antidote to that poor self-perception. Yeah. Good. Brian?
Hi, I'm Brian. Also some Pennsylvania Germanic heritage from the Alsace-Lorraine border, France, escaping war back then. And my wife found your book somewhere, so we have a newborn, and so I was like, well, if I'm going to be adding to Ancestry, I might as well do some work on the back end.
Right.
So it came with good timing on maternity leave, and so I tried one of the exercises to follow one of my lines back to an intact older ancestor, and he was cool. Like, we hung out, it was great. We dig on tequila together. Apparently that's his. He's like, he's never had it before, but we. Right. Like, okay, what is this again?
Good.
It was cool. Like, I felt like I'd actually connected and had a relationship with another. And I've never done any of this before, so I was kind of feeling my way through. But I was wondering whether I can. Kind of contacted this guy through my most intact line so far. I kind of scanned them the way you described, like 1 to 10, and then pick that one. And then I was like, and then I'm wondering, can I recruit his support for these other lines, or is it better to recruit one from each of those other?
It's my habit to do the second thing you're describing.
What's that?
It's my habit to do the second thing on any given lineage of focus, to connect with the older anchors of that lineage.
Rather than them crossing lineages?
Well, once they become part of your spirit team, of course they can travel with you and help you, and so there's momentum that builds with the work. But the ancestors, think of them as the face of the collective spirit of the lineage. The way that Westerners, generally speaking, think of the dead is they think of individuals and of the recent dead. And I'm saying both of those are limiting, and they're a function of our cultural just lack of framework. And I'm inviting instead to think also of the older ancestors, the ones before remembered names, and to consider our ancestors as lineages more than individuals. And it's a scale of relating with them that I think is safer, and it brings in more vitality and energy, and it feels true to the form of the ones who are well in spirit. They have a more group consciousness to them. And so if you're thinking of a group lineage, then the well ancestral guide is able to be the face of that lineage. If you like, ritually mask technologies are like that. In Yoruba culture, Egungun, the ancestral masquerade, erases the individually of the one who's in the masquerade, and then the ancestors speak through that human body as the ancestors in community. And you don't identify who's in the suit if you know. So the mask, by erasing the individual, it allows a collective consciousness to come through. When a lineage is well, like was it your father's line? Or mother's father?
It was my father's,
Yes.
or no, my mother's father's.
Okay, and as your mom's dad passed?
Yeah.
Okay, so if that whole lineage becomes well in spirit, ideally your mother's father could also speak through the collective, with the collective energy of the lineage.
Yeah.
And there's a way that it feels different. When someone who's recently, like a grandparent or a parent who's died, when you've done this work in the lineage as well, and they show up in the dreams, let's say, and they're like, hello, it's me, and there's this whole field of energy around them, or they're saying mystical, strange things they would not have normally said during life, is typically an indicator that the lineage is wearing the face of that person in the lineage.
Yeah.
So any bee can speak for the hive. Kind of
Right.
thing. So in that sense, it's beneficial to find a contact on the other lineage you're working with.
Got it.
Make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, good. Good, stick with it, yeah.
Hi, I'm Josie. I don't know much more than Polish settler descent. And
Speak up just a little, I heard
Oh, I
just the
just-
last thing, yeah.
I just don't know much about my ancestry, except for like Polish settler descent.
Right?
And so I just wanted to share the experience that stimulated the question I'm about to ask. I was on the way here, and I took the BART from Berkeley. And in the little BART, when you're buying your ticket, there's a little pay box. And in there, I found some coins. I was like, oh, I'm going to take these. And one of them was a 10-cent coin from Poland.
Right, because that happens all the time.
Polska. Yeah, like, right on there. And so anyway, so at the same time that I think that we have ancestral ties to land, at the same time I'm thinking migration is naturally human. I mean, from
It
climate
is.
change, from violence, from whatever it is, migration is natural. But I'm wondering if we have a certain belonging to a piece of land that our ancestors are from more than we belong to pieces of land that our ancestors are not from, or someone else's ancestors are from.
Yeah. So let me speak to two things. The first is about how do we communicate with the ancestors. It's not just during ritual or trance work or things like that. It's also through dreams. It's also through synchronicities like what you're speaking of. And I think it's part of their training as well. It's like, okay, you've been dead for 5 years now. We want to see if you can make a coin appear. On the night of the ancestor talk, now, do it. And you're like, okay, where are the other coins? They're at the BART station. Okay, where's the BART station? Okay, it's these fast-moving energies. Okay, go over here. Okay, coin is going to appear, and so whatever. So they have to figure out how to come to a person in a dream, or make things appear, or make events change. And so, yeah, so it's a fun training for them, I think. And belonging is a really layered and vulnerable and precious and important question that has to do with our sense of exile from the more unbroken, continuous connectivity that we incarnate from. And so in some ways our longing for a sense of home and place is an echo of our longing for being in the realm of spirit, I guess, put it that way. And that doesn't, I'm not saying that somehow this world isn't that, but a lot of spiritual practice in a way is to marry those two, or to see that, to bring that quality of intimacy and connectivity here and to stabilize it. I was supporting at a bear dance ceremony over in, I don't know, I forget my directions here. Looks like east to me, but maybe not. At Hunter's Point, in any case, in Bayview, with Ohlone people in 2011. They were up from Southern California, so Costa Lone, Rumson, Ohlone people, Tony Sheridan. But they were, both, but especially young men, were doing a bear dance. And we built a sweat lodge and doing prayers, and it was great. And it's an area that has experienced a lot of desecration and is the epicenter of the racism that still plays out here in San Francisco, and history of desecration of land and Superfund sites and all that. So they're doing ceremony there. There's this traditional Ohlone land here. And some of the men, at a certain point, they're just dancing, and they're the bears. They have bear suit, skins on and everything, doing doctoring. And what I observed is this real sense of healthy pride that comes from, this is our home. Our people have been here for a long time, and we belong. And that sense of rootedness, right? I'm like, that's beautiful. How do other than Ohlone people arrive at that here? How do people of Polish or German or Irish or Spanish ancestry arrive at that, or African ancestry in North America, when the circumstances are voluntary, non-voluntary, like arrival here, like whole spectrum of often difficult conditions by which people come here? Yeah, that's a good question. I don't presume to have an easy answer to, but what I can say that is getting to know your own blood ancestors in the present, as a living group or community of forces that support you in the present, allows for the possibility of then introducing yourself more properly to the spirits of the land and the ancestors of the land. Because you can say, hey, it's me and my people in these lineages ritually, and we have come here with this bundle of offerings that I've done my best to prepare to say, respect to you, Ohlone ancestors, like the Ama Ohlone Emekuuko. We greet you, we brought you something, we're doing our best. The history here is horrible, we're sorry. This is how I came to be here. I want to be in right relationship with you. Okay, so the ancestors of place who are not related to you by blood are, ritually speaking, gatekeepers for your connection with the other than human community there as well. Because if you've bypassed them and you haven't given respect to the ancestors of the land, no matter how you got there, even if it sucked, like you arrived where you're at and you don't have as much historical seniority in a place, give respect to the ancestors by way of your people. If you haven't met your people, because you haven't sought to know them, your introduction doesn't carry as much gravitas, right? So you introduce yourself to the land and the people, and you ask to get to know the ones who are there. And from there, another layer of belonging that is earth-rootedness in a culturally ethical, sensitive way can start to play out. Because you're giving respect to the history, and you're sitting in your own ancestral seat rather than acting like a cultural ghost. As part of the problem, one of the problems with whiteness as an irredeemably nonsense category of thing is that it is, it's not culturally specific enough. It's a construct that's so based in power and exploitation, and that is historically recent. And so to even say you're a Polish ancestry, then, at least in part, rather than only to say I'm a white person, I mean, you need to own that and the implications of that. But ritually speaking, it's not that interesting. It's not that useful. You need to be more specific and deconstruct this like monolithic idea of different, like 4 different races. Like, what's nonsense? And so, so get to know your own blood lineages and root in with the land where you're at, with their backing. And then the other piece that leads to feeling at home is knowing your own specific destiny and doing what you're specifically here to do. If you're doing that, you'll feel more eclipsed by bigger energies. And that's very different from feeling isolated. Yeah. Thanks. Yeah, it's good. Others? Yeah.
My name is Hallie,
Hey.
and I would love to know more about how you sense the ancestors when you're there, how you communicate with them.
Yeah. What's important is that there are many different pathways of communication with the others. And that the way I might experience them isn't going to be necessarily how others experience them. I tend to have a lot of like earth and metal and fire and mentally active energy in my field. So for the really watery, intuitive, psychic friends of mine, like they might just be like, oh, the spirits say this, and I'm like, okay, you know, I need to go at it a different way. It needs to be more active. I might do divination. I'm listening to my dreams. I'm tracking for synchronicity, but I'll be like talking, then suddenly I need to talk about this other thing. And so then that's them, you could say. I do ritual work, but it tends to have a lot of commotion around it. And that's part of why I resonate some ritually with Yoruba culture is this is a lot of commotion. It's not, I've done Zen retreats and they're good for me, but it's very different than what we do in Nigeria. And so stylistically, you got to find out what works for your temperament. And it's important to not compartmentalize the relationship with the spirits to just ritual. Like this ritual, not ritual distinction isn't really, it's just there's always something happening. And potentially at any time, something's, you know, could just drop in and happen. So kind of what you do is you set up the conditions for really magical life. You have a shrine for them, pray for them, you get to know them, you do the other things, and then you watch what happens. And then when something happens, you're like, ah, thanks. Or like when the Polish coin appears in the bar, you're like, oh, dziękuję, or whatever. You say something, you greet them back in Polish if you have any. And so you like, and then you act like, you don't even act surprised. You're like, yes. And then you go home and you put 2 coins on the altar, and then they're like, oh, they're listening. So you can do things to receive and up the signal from them. So it's a bit of a dance in that way. Let it be joyful and fun. Otherwise, it has this uptight religious vibe, and it's a buzzkill for people. So, yeah, good. Thanks. Whatever gets you there. Yeah.
Hey, I'm Melanie.
Hey.
I don't know that much about your work. I'm really enjoying being here, but it's a total fluke that I'm here. I'm really grateful. I walked Myrtle
Ancestors
Street.
guided you here.
I walked Myrtle Street, which is a name of a grandma I never got to know. And her husband is actually my last remaining grandparent. And their lineage goes back to the Holocaust. And I am the eldest of the eldest of the eldest, and he is that eldest. So a whole heap of religious pressure got put on me from a very young age, of which my free-spirited father told me, don't do it, it's a trap. And so I stated the fear that I saw in their religion from a very young age, which essentially got me disowned by my grandfather when I was about 12 or 13. And he's my last remaining grandparent, right? And there's this, I have reached out since then a couple of times. I've had doors slammed in my face and hung up on the phone and these sorts of things. And there's this element of like, you can't teach an old dog new tricks, right? Do I have, there's an element of like, can you teach a dead dog new tricks? Like, this is what you're saying, right? But it's like, I'm wondering if there's an ability to like tune in with the ancestors above that, so that when like it might like speed up the process, like not necessarily of him dying, just that when he does die, he'll be a bit like, I'd love for him to like be like harmony, but it just feels like so far off.
Oh no, it's spot on what you're saying. For one, sometimes dying is a great development in a person's journey as a soul. And the dead become when people die, they become way less dogmatic, typically. And the dead, because they don't have bodies, it's harder for them to really resist. If there's a whole bunch of beneficial energy that comes into their field, they tend to respond to it, even if it's like a siege for a while, because they're stubborn. And so healing proceeds way more quickly when you don't have a body, typically. And you absolutely can come to be in strong, direct, beneficial relationship with your lineage blood ancestors. And absolutely they can, that is the fulfillment of what is worthwhile about the pressure that you inherited. Are you Jewish along that side of your family? I don't mean to assume just because.
Yeah, well, yeah, it's my mother's side, so yeah, and they're all Jewish along
Right.
that line. My sister sort of stepped into it a bit more, but I never really.
One person you might, I co-taught training ancestral healing in Jewish traditions with a friend and student, Taya Shear, who does a lot of work with Jewish ancestral healing in these in this way, and is highly non-dogmatic as a youth, and so she might be a good person to connect with. But to know that there are other people of like witchy, not uptight Jewish folks of, should I say witchy and Jewish in the same sentence?
I love it.
Yeah, okay, you're good. Sorry, I'm not Jewish. I think that's okay. And who are working actively with the ancestors, and who see that as a real kind of devotion to tradition. I see it that way too.
Yeah.
And in the training that I co-led on that, as a kind of a guest, I'm like, I'll bring the ancestor tech, you bring the Judaism, we'll do a workshop. It's kind of like that. And it worked, but as the guest person in that space, culturally, I could see that there's a lot of need for that, a lot of like wreckage, ancestral damage, and not just the obvious, massive traumas of the last century, but also very bright souls and spirits trying to temper that and mediate that and repair that, like ancestors of tradition who are like, trying to bring in whatever energies they can bring into that and call people to repair it.
Yeah.
So be hopeful about that. Consider reaching out to, let's chat after if you want to be in touch. Like, yes. And that can be a really benevolent and useful kind of revenge. It's well channeled, like revenge about having been pressured. It's like, you want me to do tradition? I'm going to go to the ancient ones.
Yeah.
We're going to do tradition. It might not be how you think it's going to be, right? So good.
Yeah.
Thanks for speaking up. Be hopeful about it. Yeah. Let me make space for others who haven't shared yet. We'll take just another 5-10 minutes of chatting, and if there's anything. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Gloria.
Yeah.
And it's possible some of my ancestors knew yours in Pennsylvania
Oh,
back in
good.
the early colonial days.
Pittsburgh area.
I just recently found out that ancestors on my mother's side have been in North America since the early colonial days. I had no idea, actually. I
Yeah.
just started researching it a couple months ago. And my father's side came directly from Germany. So anyway, before I started researching it or even thinking about it, I felt like there was a big dark cloud over the whole concept of my ancestry, and just felt like I realized I was very angry at them.
Uh-huh.
And as I started to research, started to see them more as people who did their best how they could in their time period and what they had to work with. So I feel more at ease within myself about them, but how can I tell whether it's really affecting them? Or how do you distinguish sort of your own emotional reaction to the work from actual messages or communication from them?
If you were to do, let's say, scuba diving, you'd probably want like a tank and a scuba instructor, right?
Yes.
Like I wouldn't just get one on Amazon and be like, I'm just going to teach myself. So I don't say this as a self-promotional thing, but I'm saying work with the dead who are not yet well, also known as most people's ancestors, is something that is often delegated to religious specialists because it is potentially edgy or even dangerous.
So work with the teacher?
Work with,
I mean,
at least at the front end, work with somebody who has some training in it. And I have a strong ethic about the work being accessible to people of different economic means. And so I ask all the people I train to do a certain number of low-income sessions and to keep the work accessible and all that. So there are 5 different ways that I've set up to engage with the work. One is in-person trainings, which they're great. I came to California, the training sold out, sorry. But the second is an online course, which is running now, and it starts again in the fall. And another is, and the big one is through the sessions it's on my website, Practitioner Directory. And that can totally happen through distance work with people, because they're stepping you through relating with your people. They're not going to be like, Gloria, your grandmother tells me to tell you this. They're going to have you tune in. And so it's stepping the client through the work directly. And then another is the book, and which is a how-to book. So you can engage with the exercises in there. But you have to be a little bit of a self-motivated ritualist to have that really work. Like I put it out there, but most people aren't really going to do it that way. But if some people do, great. It's all in there. Yeah. And I can't remember the fifth way.
So you're saying by doing the practices, it will become evident what's my thought and what may be coming from
for sure.
another level.
Once you actually tap in with the ancestors, you'll be like, oh, that's something other than me. So one of the initial ritual kind of spirity person skills is recognizing when you're in contact with a thing. You have the sense that you're not just imagining me, like we're having a conversation. There are ways you know because we're habituated to recognize self-other in the physical world. So you can cultivate that same sense of like, man, is there something, what is it? Something's happening with the not physically incarnate ones.
Right.
And so it just takes a little practice.
I mean, I did have some interesting dreams.
Yeah, so all that, they can speak through dreams, all that. So you basically, you make it and you say, all right, whatever this is, I'm interested enough, I'm going to take a step toward it. Let me set up a session or two, let me get the book, or let me just root around in it and see what happens for a bit. So just move toward it and make some space for it is the main thing. And then look up, recess, yeah. Good.
Are you willing to share anything about your ritual objects on the table?
It's not that important for what we're doing. They're IFA things. I'm initiative IFA, and so it's a hand of IFA, and it's just for prayer, yeah, and
From
initiative
the
of Marisha.
Buddha?
Yeah. And Yoruba tradition happens to be one traditional African path or tradition that allows for non-Yoruba people to participate. And so I've been fortunate to be able to go there and learn, be a student of the language and culture. And we got the enjoyment of hosting our teacher and his family in Asheville in September, so that was nice. But what I'm teaching here doesn't presume to represent that. They don't have a big technology for ritual, like for cultural repair work with the ancestors. And like, I've been trying to explain in layers the trouble to my teacher, and he's just like, he's kind of like, damn, like, what'd you do? And like, this is bad history here. And there was a interaction, well, whatever, I know we're recording it, but it's an example of how, now the history in Africa is also differently very difficult because of colonialism and European occupation, depending where on the continent. And so it's differently difficult. But there was someone of African American ancestry sitting with a Yoruba teacher a few months back and saying to him, how can I trust you when your ancestors sold my ancestors into slavery? Or how, like, basically saying how we have an ancestral thing that for me is in the field between the two of us, and it's heavy and it's complicated. And his response, I about fell over. I'm like, he gave a Yoruba proverb, which is like, the person who can't forget, yesterday's harm will have no one to play with today. I'm like, I certainly couldn't say that, but it was like, I mean, I see the wisdom of it in the interaction, but at the same time, it's like, he's also communicating like, it's hard for me as an African to understand your experience as an African American and why this is so charged for you. Like, what's the problem? Just come dive in and ritually do it. And I'm sitting back as a white guy from Ohio being like, oh man, like the waters are deep here, and like, dear Africa, like, you, Aluo, my teacher, were raised in this traditionalist context where he's very held from being a boy and initiated and all like stewed in it. And And there's so many people here of all different backgrounds who are like kind of cultural orphans almost. It's very painful. And so coming with this complicated longing to intact systems, and the intact systems are just like, what? Just come do the stuff. It's like, so it's, yeah, I forget your original question. Oh, you said like alter.
Oh.
Yeah, Yoruba stuff.
And that was sort of by way of being curious about where
Where's this come from?
Yeah.
I know. I get asked that. That's a fair question. I was encouraged in the late 90s by my first teachers in paganism, shamanism, like witchy white people in Ohio, to connect with my ancestors. And that just a day of ritual around that set a lot of things in motion for me. And a lot of the implications kind of, I ran with them and ended up kind of systematizing it in a way. But I didn't learn it as an intact method from somebody else. So I don't want to be like, it's my method. But I guess it is. But the elements, none of the elements in it are things that you couldn't find somewhere else. But it is a developed, field-tested approach to safely engage in repair work with blood lineage ancestry. And in that way, I feel like it speaks to a cultural need that we have here that is not as needed in places where things are more intact ritually. So, like that. And it's not the whole picture on the ancestors. If you do all the repair work, you arrive at neutral. You go from ancestral deficit to square one, which is great. And you can start engaging in rituals of maintenance and celebration with your people. Yeah. Any last question? Does anybody who hasn't spoken have a thing before we complete?
I just have a quick question. Do you have any teachers in Europe who do your work?
Not yet. I gotta get invited. I want to go.
Oh,
Yeah.
I'll invite
Right.
you to come there.
Okay, go to Croatia. I'll do it. We gotta talk because
Okay.
I'm on kind of on paternity leave. But even though I'm out in California, because we had a baby. But besides that, I like the idea. Last thing, yeah?
I'm not sure this is probably a big tangent and probably not the right time to ask this question, but how do you find your destiny?
Yeah.
You said that before and I was
You
just
have to
like,
sign up for a very expensive session. No. Sorry. I'm so like annoyed that I've become a spiritual teacher because there's so much like about it in the West. It's a really relevant question. So let me try to say things about it before we complete. It's not a static thing, for one. It's a bit more of like, what are my gifts? What are my particular kind of medicines or affinities or qualities that I bring to the world? And how can I spend my time in a way that involves me expressing those for the well-being of the earth and others and all that? So how can I be expressed and be myself, right? So a little bit it's like that. A little bit it can be like, what do I need to be taken care of? What are things I might need to focus on or accomplish, or types of work I might need to do, things like that, which can include things like parenting or like things that are not vocation. Like destiny is bigger than vocation. And getting to know your ancestors and lineages, you can understand what are some of the gifts you inherit from the people. And now if you, after doing a cycle of that kind of work, are like, I've transformed the intergenerational pain that I'm down lineage from, so that's not obscuring my perception. I see this basket full of gifts that I've inherited from my people. Let me now ask again, how do I apply these gifts for the well-being of the world in a way that does honor to my people and my family and the land? Now you're better positioned to ask the question once you've gotten out from underneath the weight of ancestral unhealed stuff. So those are some ways to move toward the question. Intensive spiritual practice can be good. I'm a big fan of group therapy, and because it helps to get the wounding that we've inherited often, so it's out of the way of the soul coming through. And having people around you who can really see you clearly. You know what it's like to be seen well, hopefully. And whoever those people are, you ask them, what do you see when you see me? Help me to see myself more clearly. So having those people around you and getting clarity is just step one. Because then you got to get busy and do it and not die. And like actually have the energy to realize it and carry it out. And so sometimes people have clarity and they spend an extra decade still stuck on seeking clarity, but not actually doing it. And so sometimes it's like, we gave you the breadcrumb. You're standing there looking at the breadcrumb, like, step ahead. And then you step ahead and there's an avalanche and then things happen and then it's like, okay, there's the other breadcrumb. And then, so it's kind of a, they'll give you bit by bit. Because if you had it all at once, you'd get scared and you wouldn't do anything. So sometimes all we need is the step in front of us, really. And sometimes that's all, you just get what you need to do today. So there's always stuff we can be doing to move closer to it. Because we always have habits that are like checking Facebook more probably isn't helping, or whatever. There's always things we're doing that are not actually working toward that purpose. So, but you want to hire people, if you can afford to, who are a little scary and seem useful and will call you out on your stuckness. Because we'll be dead soon. And you don't want to be like, oh, I've paid my bills and it's okay. And they're like, really? That's your debrief? So, there's going to be an accounting, at least from our own higher self and ancestors. Be like, how'd it go? Talk to me. And you want to have some stories, right? So, good. Okay, so let me say a thing. I appreciate your patience with the talk. It's super good to be here and hang out with everybody. I brought some books. If you would like to buy a book, I'm inviting $20 for them. And if you want me to sign it, I would sign it. It's fine. And if you would like to be in the loop about what I'm doing with respect to teaching, then you could sign up for the newsletter. You just write your email clearly, and there's just one email a month, and that's how I share about stuff. And there's a lot of free talks and resources and stuff on my website. So even though I live in North Carolina, there's still other stuff that could be useful. And there is a new cycle beginning in May of the practitioner training. So if you're a particularly well and grounded and motivated person with this work, it's not out of the realm of possible that you could train to be guided for others. And so I'm in the fortunate position of having more applicants than there are spaces, so I'm learning how to be selective, I guess. And if you want me to invite me to Ireland or Iceland or Sweden to teach, or no, I'm sorry, I'm not actually kidding. Yeah. Thanks for your patience and for being here, everybody. Okay.